Grief is not the end of your story, it's the beginning of a new chapter. Welcome to the Empower Grief Journey podcast. I'm your host, Chris Mamone, and I'm the founder of the Empower Grief Journey coaching and podcast platform. This podcast is your dedicated space for healing, growth, and transformation. Each episode brings real conversations with people around the world who have navigated grief and discovered the strength to create new inspired beginnings in their life. Together, we will walk from grief to empowerment through stories, practical tools, and actionable insights. You'll uncover the hidden gifts within your grief, reclaim your personal power, and step into a future filled with courage and hope. Today, I have an amazing guest with us. Her name is Ally Dalsimer. She's an award-winning author, motivational speaker, life coach, certified facilitator, and podcast host. In 2022, Ally ran for the U.S. Congress, bringing her passion for public service to the forefront. As a speaker and as an author of a multi-award winning book, It's Okay to Not Be Fabulous Every Day, A Journey to Self-Discovery, Ally weaves together stories of life's struggles and triumphs to reveal profound truths about identity, authenticity, and purpose, offering audiences a roadmap for resiliency rooted in honesty, humor, and hope. And so, without further ado, I'm going to introduce you guys. Ally, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Chris. Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to talking with you again. We had such a powerful conversation last time you and I talked, and I'm looking forward to getting to know more about your grief journey that you've been on and also about your book. I love that you find a way to share stories and honesty, but also throw a little bit of humor in the mix to lighten it up a little bit.
Yeah. Well, without humor, we would all be in a much worse place, right? Humor, it's the
I,
best medicine.
It truly is, and I couldn't agree more with you about that. And so, what I'd love to do as we get started, if you could share with us and the audience, a little bit about your grief story and just where grief is taking you.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's hard to know where to begin. Each of us, of course, has ups and downs in our lives and what can be really hard in one point can give us strength in another. Um, and I my early childhood was very tumultuous. We moved a lot. I lived in 8 different places, during the first few years of my life. I think I was, I was 8 years old. We lived in 5 different places, including 3 different countries. Um, and so that was turbulent. Um, and I think gave me a sense of resiliency just from experiencing difficulties when I was young. But my recent grief journey, and I think that the reason I mentioned my childhood is because I really think it's given me a positive attitude, right? Like this too shall pass, and you can get through it, and there will be a tomorrow. And all of those things sound very trite, but I think that if you learn those early on, you can really embody them and then apply them later. So the journey we had talked about was more recent, started about a decade ago, when my husband was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And anybody who's experienced cancer progression, treatments, and ultimately loss, really understands how devastating that can be. And his case was very advanced. It was pretty systemic. It was in his lungs and his bones, and eventually traveled to his brain. And the doctors had given him about 6 months to live at one point, and unfortunately, he ended up dying about 6 weeks later, just a couple days after his 52nd birthday. So, I found myself a widow and a mom trying to raise 2 kids who were dealing with the loss of their father at a time when they were trying to go through their own personal struggles. My son was transitioning from middle school to high school, and my daughter was transitioning from elementary to middle school. And of course, that's a very traumatic and challenging time for kids. And of course, on top of that, having to deal with the death of their father, we did bury him the Saturday before the Monday when school started. So that was challenging. And within that first year after he was gone, I was raised, I was an apartment kid, latchkey kid. I was raised by a single mom. My parents did split when I was 5, and it was like we had keys. We went around. It was like there's this old show, One Day at a Time, with like the mom with the 2 girls and Schroeder and whatever the maidens. That was my life, right? That was my life. So I'd never lived in an actual house before until I moved in with my husband, and so he took care of all that stuff. And then the very first year that he was gone, I had an electrical circuit that caught fire. We had the the fridge went out. We had a wiring issue. Well, that was part of that. There was just all these things that went out. The heat went out. All this stuff. And so I was like desperately trying to figure that all out while not scaring my kids. Um, and Fast forward a little bit, pulling my life together. I did at that time start some life advice for my kids, and I'll get back to that, just knowing that he wasn't going to be there, and also as a coping mechanism for myself, I think, just trying to give them some insights. And life got busy, I put it away. And we fast forward a little bit, and I ended up, I had a career. I'd been an environmental management policy person for about 30 years, and that job was eliminated during the first Trump administration without warning. I literally went into a meeting with my boss, didn't know what she wanted to discuss, and I had all these file folders for all these different projects I was working on, and I set them on the table. I was like, I didn't know what you want to discuss, but I've been happy to give you updates on everything you need. And she said, yeah, actually, we're letting you go. I was like, what? Like, what do you mean? And she said, well, we've eliminated your position. And I was like, you've eliminated my position? Like, couldn't even wrap my brain around that, right? Like, what does that even mean? And Anyway, so that was unexpected. I did take a couple months off to visit with my kids, and my husband had died in 2015, and this was now 2019. And so my my perspective had shifted a great deal in that time, realizing that I needed to be everything to my children. And so I did take the summer off just to spend with them. Um, and then the pandemic hits. I started a business. I started to work from home in that fall. I started a business, and it actually was going pretty well. Then the pandemic hit. So my business failed. And of course, we all remember what that lockdown was like. We didn't understand COVID at the time. And, you have to, like, you go outside, and then you come in and you take off your 3 masks, and you throw all of your clothes into the hamper, and you shower before you go into the house because, we just didn't know what to expect. And it was a very stressful time, and the schools closed, and, trying to help my kids deal with everything that they were going through, plus dealing with my own isolation, really missing my husband, and not being able to see my mother, who was elderly at the time. She was locked up in her apartment, and so we spoke every day, sometimes twice a day. We were very close at the end there, but anyway, fast forward, I ended up deciding to run for public office. That experience was, for those who haven't been in it, there's the old saying, there's 2 things you don't want to see being made, and one is sausage, the other's politics. You don't really understand what that means until you've looked behind the curtain. There are just really mean and ugly people who are involved in politics. And somebody had said, politics is like Hollywood, but for ugly people. And I always thought that had like a mean reference to their looks. And I've realized that has nothing to do with their looks. It is everything to do with uh, the really just nasty backstabbing nature of a lot of people. Not everybody. I met some really wonderful, wonderful people who were supportive of the campaign, and who were running in other races and whatnot, um, and made a couple friends from that. Uh, but but coming from, I worked in natural resources, and when you work in the environmental field trying to save the avifauna and the flora and fauna, and everybody, even if you're coming from different perspectives, everybody wants the same thing, whether you're from the hunting and fishing consumptive side or whether you're from, the non-consumptive, the bird watchers, the wildlife viewers, that kind of thing. Everybody wants to save the resources. And so you work together, you come together, you find common ground, and you achieve goals that mutually benefit the resource for whatever reason you happen to want it. Not so in politics. So that was probably one of the most traumatic experiences of my life. I During that time, my mother became ill, and she was in intensive care in the hospital for just under 3 weeks. And so, um, I was visiting her as much as I could and whatnot. And when it came time for her to come out, they wanted to put her in a rehab facility, but about 3 years earlier, she'd been in a rehab facility and she'd been abused. And so I was not going to be doing that again. So I brought her home to live with me. And so she stayed on our on this little sofa. We moved a sofa into a little dining area that we have. And I was working on the campaign, trying to, deal with my kids. The house flooded for the second time. So I didn't mention, but the first time the house flooded was shortly after the year after my husband died, and a pipe burst. We have a little slab home, and the pipe burst underneath it. So they had to dig up the whole foundation of the house, and we had to move out for a month. So this time our hot water heater burst and it flooded the whole house, and we had to move out again. They bring in the industrial fans and redo everything. And so we had to try and do all that while trying to help her. It was a lot logistically. It was a great deal. Um, and she ended up she was getting better. I was in touch with, the visiting angels or whatever for home care to get her back. We, worked through rehab because I'm familiar with how to do rehab. I did quite a bit of it with my husband, and my kids both do sports, so lots of injuries there. And she was just doing great. And then she had she had the equivalent of a heart attack or a stroke, but in her gut, and her intestines just burst apart. And she went to the hospital and called 911. She went to the hospital, and they were like, "There's nothing we can do." And so that was really unexpected, even though she was older and she'd been ill. She was on the road to recovery. And so that was a really challenging time. I was still running for office. That happened in February. Um, I took one day to grieve with my kids, and then I had to get back on the campaign trail. And in fact, that's really, I think, the germ, the kernel of where the title of my book came from. It's okay not to be fabulous every day, because when you're running for office, you have to be fabulous every day. You have to smile. Mom's at home, you know, needing care. You can't leave her alone, and playing a juggling act with, your kids coming, and you're there and whatever, and you're smiling and saying, "Yes, I'm happy to talk with you about your, school board issue." Or, after she died, you know, just like inside I was grieving, but nobody wants to hear you're grieving over the loss of a parent or your spouse, because losing one triggers memories and emotions of the other losses you've had. So, the freshness of my mom dying triggered all those memories of my husband dying and everything we went through. And I'm trying to be strong for my kids, and trying to run for office and saying, yes, we definitely need to look at the labor practices for whatever. And those issues are so important to so many people. And you have to give them the attention and care that they need, because these are people's lives. But at the same time, inside, it's like, oh my goodness, right? You're trying to hold it all together. Um, I ended up ending the campaign. I won't go into all of that. Uh, but um, I had a couple months to kind of um, um, just restore, I thought. And I ended the campaign. And so I started working on, my mother wanted her ashes scattered in Wales. My grandfather came from Wales. And so she wanted her ashes scattered on her grandmother's grave site in Wales. And so, I worked with the relatives over there. We arranged it, and ended up going over there. And our first day there, my daughter and I were hit. Our car was hit by a lorry, which is a kind of truck. If you think about like one of those big heavy duty tow trucks with a big steel fronts, that's kind of what it was. Took up the whole front end of our car. We literally nearly died. Ended up on crutches. Thank God I didn't kill my daughter, because that's what was going through my mind at the time was, God, I've killed my daughter. Um, Also, they lost our luggage. So we got there on Tuesday, and the memorial service we were having at the gravesite was on Saturday, and I couldn't really walk, and so I was kind of stuck housebound. But that's actually why we were out, because we had to go buy clothes. We didn't have any clothes, and also we didn't have my mom's ashes, because they were in the luggage, and so I was kind of freaking out about that. And they finally did deliver them. We got there on Tuesday. They delivered them on Saturday morning, 2 hours before we went to the gravesite to scatter the ashes. So, that was great. We had them in time. Came back home, couldn't drive, was still freaked out about that. Anyway, fast forward, working on healing, spending time with the kids another summer with them. And then they both go off to college, and it's September, and I am alone. And I haven't lived alone since I was in my early 20s. And even then, I only lived alone for 1 year, because I had a sister. I went to, boarding school, and I had a college roommate. Um, so I only lived alone for 1 year of my entire life. And I found myself alone, no mom, no husband, no kids. They're both busy doing their thing. And I don't want to be like calling them and be like, I'm so lonely. Can you please talk to me? Because of course they have their lives, and they're doing their thing and need to uh, not have a cringy, needy mother. And I literally lay in bed, and it was raining. It was almost cliche. It was gray and cloudy and cold. And I could not think of a reason to get out of bed. I had no one around. My business had failed. I was sort of half attempting to get it going again. Um, but I really wasn't motivated to do that. Kind of lost my passion for it. I'd also, distanced myself. It had been several years at this point. So a lot of my connections from my previous work were not, I'd lost touch with them through the pandemic, and through the campaign, lost friends through the campaign. But I made myself get out of bed to feed my cat. And that was a turning point for me. That was not that it was a single epiphanic moment, like, poof, okay, that's it, I'm turned around. But that was the first sort of shift to bring me out of what had been a really, really dark few months, and try to put myself back together. And I talk about it in my book. I reframed success. And I remember that day I played with a cat, I made soup, and I washed my sheets. It's like, I've done three things. That's, you know what? And I need to be proud of myself for that. And really just started trying to be my own best cheerleader. And decided to bring out those notes, and really just read everything, all that life advice that I put together for my kids, which really started as sticky notes and whatnot that I'd had on my kitchen cabinet, just little phrases I'd written down from movies or books or song lyrics or whatever, just little nuggets of wisdom that I found throughout my life. I've been collecting them for, 20, 30 years. And that's what I had used to put down as life advice. And I read all those, and there's some wise people out there. There are wise people who have come before us, and they have so much to teach us. And so I just embraced a lot of that, and ended up writing the book. And it ended up being, that's why I added so I reissued this book in November 24. That's kind of another story, but I added a subtitle, A Journey to Self-Discovery, because in writing this book, that's what I did by following the steps. And that's what I, in turn, would hope for other people, that they can take this journey to healing, the journey to being their true selves, the journey to self-discovery. So uh, that's a very long-winded story, but that's kind of the nuts and bolts of it.
Well, Allie, I appreciate you sharing your story as much as you did, because a lot of people go through similar circumstances in life, but not everybody has the courage to talk about it and share it in such a vulnerable way. And so that's what I appreciate about you today is having that vulnerability and that strength to say, these are all the circumstances of grief I've gone through. And something that I think is very powerful about your story is a lot of people think grief is just centered around the loss of a spouse or a child or a family member. And in your case, it was losing a business too. It was losing, moving out of your house when it got flooded twice. It was running for politics and not getting that office, but also running into so many negative people along that journey. You faced grief in so many avenues and so many different areas of life. And the word that I kept thinking about as you were talking last 15 minutes was resiliency, is what I saw, because it sounds like none of these situations really stopped you. I mean, you definitely took time to grieve and pause through those, but you continue to keep going. And I just think that's something to be very proud of, that you had the courage every day to keep pushing, even though those challenges presented themselves.
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge and frankly wallow in your grief, but not for long. So, you know, I lost my job, right? 30 years, 30 years. Plus, I went back for a master's specifically for this job that I had gotten just like a year or two before, and gone, just gone, like literally in a nanosecond. And I was angry at first, but then I was just so devastated. And I gave myself a day. I gave myself a full day to just tune out and just be sad and mad and whatever. And then the next day I was like, okay, because if you allow yourself to wallow too much, it's really hard to get going again. It's I talk about that as well. It's better to float for a while than fall apart because, if you fall apart, putting yourself back together is just really, really tough. It's so much more work. And so, I don't want you to think that I didn't grieve or I didn't allow myself to have horrible, sad times because I did. I just also allowed myself that time and then moved on. And when, of course, the death of, anybody's experienced the death of someone close to them, I'd be walking in the grocery store and I'd pass my husband's favorite cereal and I'd burst into tears. And I let myself burst into tears and cry and be okay. And I would just like wave people off. People are so kind. They're like, "Are you all right? Are you?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm fine. I'm fine." But they're very kind. But I allowed myself to have that, and I pulled myself together and then moved on because if you don't allow yourself those moments to wallow, and I'm sure you know this as well as anybody, it'll just eat you up. It'll eat you away from inside, and you'll never be able to heal. So,
That's That's a place that I try to share with people, that grief is not so much about letting go and moving on, because it's really something that stays with you your whole life. And like you just said, you go down the grocery aisle, favorite cereal, that could also be seeing somebody that looks like him, or it could be, driving by a place, maybe you had a special anniversary dinner, something like that. There's all these external triggers that come along with grief. And I always try to encourage people that when you have those moments, acknowledge it and hold space for it. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with you or that you're broken or somehow have a problem. It doesn't mean that. It means you have a lot of love that's still there. You have a lot of heart in yourself, by the way. Those are good things, not bad
yeah,
things. And
yeah,
I love people that take time, like you said, to have that crying moment in the grocery store. I love that. I think that's a very good way to honor yourself. I remember one of the moments you and I talked about, going through grief, and if I remember right, correct me if I'm wrong. There was somebody that said to you about a year after your husband passed, like, "Aren't you over it yet?" Or are you
yeah,
in that? And I wanted to talk about that for a reason, because a lot of people have this mentality that you'll get over it at a certain point. And you know as well as I do from our losses that it doesn't really happen that way. What were your initial thoughts when you started hearing things like that? And did you take moments to say that that was hurtful, or I'd appreciate you not saying that? Or, how did you handle that situation when you ran into people that couldn't hold space for you?
honestly, the I remember the person who made that comment, and the first thing I thought of was, well, you've clearly never lost anyone close to you, because that was the most insensitive comment that she could have made. It was just ridiculous. And that was my thought. She just can't possibly know, because anybody who has experienced does know. Um, I did have a couple other experiences with people who had experienced their own grief, and then they were like, well, it's been a couple years, so I'm kind of over it now, which was an interesting thing for me because then my thought was, well, did I love my husband more than you loved yours? Like, why are you over it in two
Mm.
years? Like, how does that work? Um, or am I just more sensitive? I don't know. But I think what it comes down to is, and we all judge, right? It's human nature. We
Hmm.
instinctively judge. That's just the way we're wired. You look at someone, you make instant judgments. You don't do it intentionally. It just happens. And you make these judgments and these thoughts spring to your mind. But the truth is that you can't really fairly actively judge anyone for how they grieve because we all grieve in our own way. And if someone's able to get over the death of their husband in 2 years, more power to them. I I wish I could do that. I cannot. Um, and if someone, is like me and it's 10 years down the road and I still miss my husband desperately, that's okay too. That is okay too. And I I I never said that was a hurtful comment or anything like that. But what I would say is, well, that's not how I feel, and no, I am not over it, you
You
know.
know, I love your perspective on that because I was on a podcast way earlier this year, back in January when I before I even started things as a guest, and something that a host asked me and said, do you ever feel like you'll be fully healed from your loss?" And I quickly said, no, no, that's not going to happen. And he looked at me very perplexed and was like, well, why do you think that? And I said, because all the people I've met so far on my journey, including myself, if that was fully true, by the way, you and I would be able to sit here today and say that, oh, my husband died 10 years ago. That was sad, but I'm okay in life. I'm able to move on. And there'd be an emotional disconnect from that moment. You'd be able to just leave it there in the past and walk forward. But what I've come to find about people that go through grief, especially you've lost your husband you're very close to, I lost my son, that sting doesn't really go away because we're humans. We have emotion. And like you said about going to the grocery store and seeing a cereal box, if you're triggered in that moment and you have an emotional reaction, you didn't get over it. You're not fully healed. And that's the misconception I try to tell people is that healing's not a destination. It doesn't mean you'll wake up one day and say, I'm over it and I don't have to be sad anymore. And I think that denies ourself humanity, like you said. If somebody is able to get in that place, by the way, in 2 years, amazing. That's great work. I love you for that. But there's going to be people like you and I that to 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, we're not there. And that's okay. That doesn't mean there's something wrong with us. It means that we just have a lot of love there with nowhere to go. We don't have a way to put that love in a certain place. So it follows us in our life. And by holding space for it, by the way, I just think shows that you're a fabulous human being. You have emotions and you share them. And so I honor you for that.
Well, thanks. Thanks. I guess it does indicate I'm not a sociopath, so I guess that's good. You know, I think about loss and about not just loss, but traumatic experiences in our lives, like hammering a nail into a fence. And even if you take that nail out, the hole remains, right? That hole is still there. And over time, the edges will smooth and wear, but the hole never goes away. You just get used to it. That's how I kind of think of it.
I think that's a beautiful analogy because I've come to find that grief doesn't ever fully leave us. And your story, by the way, is the epitome of that. You lost your husband in 2015, your job got eliminated in 2019, you had your house flooded twice, you ran for politics, your grandmother was abused in the nursing home, you lost her in a traumatic way. Grief doesn't really go away. It's always present in our life. And so I think it's so important for us. The reason I say I don't like people that get over it or have that mentality is that it's always going to follow us. It's a memory we're always going to have. And I feel like if we choose to move on and let go all the time, we're missing a lot of gifts that will come out of that. And what I see in you, that I saw in you during our initial interview, you have a very, very big heart. There's so much, I saw so much love. I felt that off you like an energy wave pushing. And that's what I think is so beautiful about grief is that when we hold space for that, when we allow ourselves to say, I'm not okay today, like it's okay not to be fabulous every day. I love that because you're giving yourself permission to just be, to just feel. And that doesn't always have to make sense to everybody because, like we've talked about, your experience of losing your husband, I'm never going to be able to fully relate to. I'm not going to know what that feels like. I'm not going to know what it's like to walk forward in my life going through that experience you went through. But it's our ability to hold space for people who've gone through many losses of any kind and to see those moments as opportunities to learn, opportunities to be more emotionally aware or be more cognizant of how somebody else is walking their journey. Because I do think that there's so much we can learn from people who go through grief and a myriad of experiences. And that can only shape in us to be better people. It can only shape in us to be more compassionate and more empathetic towards other people. And as you said in politics, there's very nasty people in that arena. They're very disgusting people in that arena, but there's also good people too. And so if we use these experiences to better ourselves and become more compassionate and empathetic, it's almost like a domino effect. And we can give permission to other people, so to speak, to feel their grief, feel where they're at, know that they're a human, they have emotions. And I really think overall in our society, there's just so much better we could make our society as a whole if we would allow people to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true. I also think we're too hard on ourselves. I think that in a lot of ways we end up being our own worst enemies and our own um, least sympathetic supporters. We're very quick to, like, the person who came up to me in the grocery store and was like, "Are you okay? Is everything okay?" Um, if that person was experiencing grief, do you think that they would do that for themselves? Because a lot of times we tell ourselves, buck it up, pull it together. If we don't, go, 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 right? I can do this. It's all right. And and we don't grace ourselves the kindness and compassion that we give to others. And I think that's an area that we could all do better with. And that doesn't mean that we wallow in self-pity. It means that we have compassion and understanding for our situation and allow ourselves the space that we need and the time that we need to grieve in order to heal. Um, because in the end, we have to we have to move forward, right? Because if we don't move forward, we'll stagnate, we'll drown, and that's just not a good place to be. But we can't move forward if we've got no traction. Do you know what I mean by that? So if we grace ourselves enough time to plant our feet a little bit more, then we can propel ourselves forward, if that makes sense.
That makes total sense because one of the things I coach people on, believe it or not, is about emotions. People don't realize grief is a big wave and it's not linear by any means. Some days, you're going to fall apart in the grocery store. It's going to happen. I don't care how you try not to, it's going to happen. Other days, you can be fine. You can be happy and act like nothing ever happened. And so, like you said about us being our hardest critics, oftentimes where we don't mesh up with grief in a lot of ways is our conditioning, our belief systems, how we were raised, how we were taught about grief, how we were taught to feel.
Yeah.
And I've shared with people that emotions are messengers, is what they are. We can't hold an emotion, we feel emotions. And so the problem is though, when we try to suppress them or bury them or hide them, they start growing very, very big. And when we have an initial emotion, it's very small. It's easy to deal with, believe it or not. I don't care if you're angry or sad or frustrated or happy, you can deal with it when it's back here. But when it gets very, very big out here, it's a slew of different emotions, and that's really, really hard to start working through those things. It becomes a giant monster, as I like to say. Um,
Yeah.
and a lot of us, unfortunately, are raised in that environment where we do live out here in the big side of things. And when we make that shift to giving ourselves space to just process and allow ourselves to be, I think we live more present, we live more fully, and we can actually understand what grief is here to give us.
Yeah. Yeah. But you raise a really, really valid point. And a lot of us, were raised that to show emotion or to cry. Like I was always told, not to cry. It's a sign of weakness, right? If I was crying about something, some event or whatever, I remember my dad would tell me, you know, if you're going to cry, I'll give you something to cry about. And he would smack me, right? He'd smack my butt, right? Because now I have something to cry about because, missing going on a play date with my friend is not worth crying about or whatever the situation was. And I don't think that's unique. I think a lot of people were raised like that. I think it's more prevalent in some cultures than others, but that it's still something we're overcoming. I mean, I think we're made as a society. I think we've made a lot of progress towards that, but globally, I think that's probably still true in a lot of places, and I think it's worse for men than women. I think women are allowed to be emotional, because emotional means weak. Um, and men are stoic and they don't cry and they don't get upset because that's strength. Um, and I think that is still sadly a very popular way of behaving and believing. And like I said, I think it's changing, which is really good because it's just bass backwards, as they say, right? I mean,
Yeah.
showing emotion is a really healthy response, and holding everything in, it's just, as we talked about earlier, it just eats you up inside, right? It tears you apart slowly but surely. And then, like you said, you end up when finally something will happen. Finally, at some point, you will face this huge mountain of unresolved whatever messiness, and that's just a whole lot harder to deal with. So
Yeah, I've shocked people as a guest on podcasts over the last 3 months because something I say to them is exactly what you talked about, that women are emotional and men are stoic. And I've challenged that in many ways to tell people, what if women are not overly emotional? Let me ask that question. What if they're not overly emotional? What if we reframe that, by the way, that women were taught how to be emotional, how women were taught to understand emotions? They may understand it better. What if we looked at men, for example, and said men are stoic? What if we reframe that to men were taught not to cry, that it was weakness? What if we were taught that men knew two things, silence and anger? And what if we instead, by the way, threw those back asswards mentalities out the window and did the following instead? Women know emotions really well, men don't. What if we got to the middle, by the way, and had conversations to say, here's how to feel emotions, here's how to process these things. If you're silent, it probably could mean this or that. If you're angry, it's misguided emotion towards something you actually feel. What if we took time to have those deeper conversations of understanding? Because in my coaching, I've dealt with people very angry. They'll cuss and scream and do whatever, and I don't see them as anger. I don't see that. What I see is underneath that, and that's what we don't ever talk about is what's underneath that. Um, Women who are overly emotional, by the way, as society says it, I don't see overly emotional. I see something got you upset or something made you sad or a situation made you think deeply. It triggered your heart in whatever way. I care more about what's behind that thing instead of the surface level stuff that we stay at today,
mhm.
because that's where, unfortunately, in society, we are missing very big conversations with people who go through grief. We are missing conversations to help people feel seen and heard and understood. We're missing out because of these back-asswards mentalities that you brought up.
Yeah. Yeah, and to answer your question, what if? I think there'd be a whole lot less violence and unhappiness in the world.
I think
I,
so
th I
too.
think that would be the bottom line.
And I mean, what if people going through grief instead of, like that woman said to you, aren't you over it yet? What if instead somebody said, I'm really sorry that grief is hurting you today. I'm sorry that grief got really, really loud today. What can I do to support you? How can I be
Yeah,
there for you? How different would that shift in mindset be if we
yeah,
ask those questions?
right. Or just
So
give a quiet hug, not make any judgments.
I couldn't agree more,
Sometimes,
Theon.
sometimes that can be enough.
So, Allie, I wanted to ask you a big question that people go through grief that is not always talked about. What ways do you honor and remember your husband? Because I do like to talk about on this show how we can honor and remember those that were very, very close to us. And I loosely use the word celebrate because I like to be sensitive to things. But if there's ways that you honor or celebrate him, I'd love for you to share that with us.
I'm going to try not to get emotional. Um, I'll be honest, I still have pictures of him all over, and I talk to him still. I just have conversations with him. And I think a lot about how he would view different situations. And I actively try to remember jokes he told me or funny things he did. Because one of the things that really attracted me to him, I tend to be a very serious person. And one of the things that really attracted me to him was his sense of humor. He could make me laugh. So, true story, I dated when I moved back to the area. Um, I was in my mid-20s and I just was like, I'm done dating. I'm ready for a life partner. I'm at that point in my life where I'm ready for a life partner. And I dated 6 men twice, because you never want to judge on a first date, although I could tell by the first date that this was not someone I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. But I gave him a second chance, give him a second date. And it was confusing why, I was like, well, thanks so much. This was great. And they'd be like, I'll call you. And I was like, yeah, no, that's okay. No, thank you. Which was confusing for them. But, I went on my first date with Doug, and then we had our second date. And the second date, I always said I wanted to do something outside, and the closest I'd ever gotten before was an outdoor cafe. And Doug took me canoeing down the Shenandoah. So I was like, okay, here's a guy who kind of gets me. And so he got a third date. But the thing that really, really sort of nailed it for me was he just made me laugh. He just made me laugh. And, I'd experienced a lot of childhood trauma and trauma in my teens that I really don't want to go into. Um, and and was still really working through a lot of those things. And didn't have a lot of um, laughter in my life at the time. And so that's what I do. I remember the laughter.
I think that's very beautiful. And I appreciate your vulnerability and openness to be emotional with that because that shows your heart of who you are. And that's something that I try to tell people that go through grief and loss, and that's losing a spouse or losing a child like I did. It doesn't truthfully matter at that point, but I'll just say the following. If you can allow yourself to be open, like Ally has shown you guys on the podcast today, to honor and remember those parts of that person that meant a lot to you. And I'll be honest with you, Allie. I look at pictures of my son every day. I've not missed a day since he's passed, and I have a necklace with his poem from his birth that I can't look at because I'll start crying. Um, but I find ways to celebrate and honor him as much as I can, and I love that you do the same for your husband. And remembering that he made you laugh, I think, is one of the best memories that we can ever look back on, because grief can be very heavy and very overpowering and overwhelming at times. But when we have somebody close to us like that, that can make us laugh, and when we look back and we hear that through them, it can bring a little spark of I call it a glimmer of hope and a glimmer of happiness in a moment that's very challenging. So I just want to say
Yeah.
thank you for sharing that.
Well, there's this saying that a person is never dead as long as someone remembers them.
That is a powerful statement, and I couldn't agree more. So, so Ali, I wanted to ask you too, as we get wrapped up here, I wanted to talk a little bit about your book.
Okay.
When did you decide to write that book, and how did it come to fruition?
So it started as life advice for my kids. It really did. It started as hundreds and hundreds of sticky notes that were up on this cabinet in my kitchen. They covered two tall cabinets. And my daughter at one point was like, no, that's a total eyesore. You need to take it down. And so I took them all down and I stuck them in a folder. And then after my husband passed, I pulled them all out and I started putting them together as like I said, life advice for my kids. And all kinds of things like a stitch in time saves nine. And then I realized I needed to provide like some explanation because they might not understand necessarily what each of these little statements means. And so I started adding a little to it. And um, when I went back and pulled it out again after a few years, I put it together in this little booklet format. It was a just a slim thing. It was maybe 40 or 50 pages. And I sent it to them, and they shared it with their friends, and they were the ones who encouraged me to publish it and said that other people would find value in it, um, and that I should really put it out there publicly. And I shared it with a couple folks in my book club, and got good feedback. And so I thought, you know what? Okay, fine. And so I contacted a friend and had her create a cover, which I thought was so clever, but it turned out to be overly complicated. It didn't work. But um, anyway, I published it, and I started getting, it's sort of the friends and family buy it kind of thing. And I ended up getting some really kind of powerful feedback from it. It's a very simple book. There's a little quote, and then there's just 2 or 3 pages where I share a personal story or an anecdote of some kind, um, to help illustrate it. And the goal is to simply say, here's a quote, and here's how I look at it. And you look at it now with your lens and filter it through your perceptions and perspective and see if it speaks to you. And I got really amazing feedback, from people. I started getting emails and whatnot about how the book was speaking to them. And I thought, okay, well, that's heavy. That's a lot. And so then I took a really hard look at the book and decided, you know what, if this is going to be out there, um, it needs to be more. So I went through it and I updated some of the internal text a little bit. You can actually kind of pick it out what I did. But I added some introductory materials to kind of frame it. And then I added some bonus materials at the end, which are the equivalent of here's your first step towards what I call embracing your inner fabulosity so that you can maximize your personal potential and be successful. And by success, I define success as loving who you are, who you're with, and what you're doing. And that to me is success. And then I got a better cover that fits more in line with the motif of sort of that self-help motivation book. Because I did have one person say, "Oh, I thought it was a romance." Not a romance. And and I put it back out there last November, and it's actually done really well. It's won a number of awards, um, it's getting a little bit of a bigger platform, and I just I just I'll be honest, Chris, I just feel really blessed and grateful and humbled that that this message helps, that it helps people, even if in some small way, because that's really powerful.
I think
And it
that's
makes me feel
beautiful.
good. It's selfish, right? It makes me feel good. It's like, oh, I did something good. There is value to my life.
You
So
know what? There's something very valuable about that, and that kind of selfish is totally fine, by the way. I try to tell everybody that. I guess my big question I have for you, because I see how far you've come along. If you were to talk to yourself 10, 12, 15 years ago and seeing where you are today and where you were then, what would you tell your younger self?
be kinder to yourself, have more patience for yourself. You don't need to be perfect all the time. It's okay not to be fabulous every day, because I very much lived, I was raised in such a way that I was a very type A person. I couldn't make a mistake. Um, and I would really beat myself up a lot. Really, really beat myself up if I made any kind of error or mistake. And I would tell myself, just it really is okay. But having said that, I don't think my younger self would have believed me. I wasn't ready to hear that message.
And I think that's the beauty of what you've gone through in your grief journey, by the way, is all of those experiences, losing your husband, losing your business, losing your job, running for politics, all those events that happen in your life, they all happen for you, believe it or not. And I
Yeah.
know it's a hard thing to hear, but it all happened for you, because who you become today is the real beautiful, authentic self that was always there. It just didn't get space until now. And so I see a beautiful person, Allie. I see a beautiful person that's survived a lot of hard experiences in life, but you're now out there with a book that is helping more people than you probably ever met and even know about. And that's the beautiful, beautiful gift hidden inside your grief journey.
Thanks for that. Thank you, Chris. I will tell you the one thing that I really take from it. I have developed such a close bond with my children. I have learned so much from them. And I think I don't know what it is to lose a child and if that brings you closer to your spouse, but it was very hard at first because there's a natural entropy where you get pulled apart. And I fought very deliberately against that. And the end result is a closeness that I'm not sure would exist because the grief has been shared and it has bonded us. The grief of losing their grandmother, my mother, their father, my husband, that combined grief means that we as a unit are incredibly close. And I'm not sure that would have happened. It's the silver lining to the cloud.
That's why I think grief is such an interesting experience of life, is that sometimes we're grief, I call grief a personal transformation journey, is what I call it, because the version of ourselves that existed prior to all these things happening, it dies in that moment. When your husband passed away, that past version of you is gone. When you know, when their children lose their father, that version of themselves is gone, and now there's this new version of ourselves, and it's a powerful moment that's very uncertain. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know who we're going to become. We don't know what beliefs and convictions we have are going to change in our life. We just don't know, and so it's this kind of experience of learning that and giving ourselves grace and being kind, as you said, to give ourselves space to understand this new person we're becoming. And I love how you said that that's a silver lining, that you may not have all come together the way you did had that not happened. And to see so much love and kindness, I can feel it off you, by the way. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I see just this love and kindness energy coming off you a lot because of all these things. And again, I just think that's one of the most beautiful silver linings of grief experiences that we go through in life.
Yeah. Well, we all have a choice, right? We have a choice of how to be and how to live. And I think that once we learn to accept who we are and embrace our what I call perfect imperfections and really learn to love ourselves, then it's a lot easier to be kind to others.
That is beautifully said, Allie. I hope that message reaches lots of people. That would change our world in so many ways for the better. So Allie, as we wrap up the podcast, I want to ask you a couple questions. If
Mhm.
people listening to the podcast today want to connect with you, where can they find you? And also, where can we find the book?
Yeah, thanks. The best way is through my website and my newsletter. You can go to allydalsimer.com/newsletter. I send it out every couple weeks. And you can always reply to that. It comes straight to me. You can reach out to me on social media. I'm on Instagram under my name, and we're also starting a new podcast called So What's Your Process? And the book is available wherever you buy books. The ebook is only available on Amazon, but it's available pretty widely in English, Spanish, and an audiobook. So,
For listeners today, I will have Allie's social media links, her website, her newsletter, and also a link to where you can find her book. I want to encourage you guys to reach out and connect with her and download a copy of her book if you can. She's got a beautiful story, as you guys have heard over this last hour. And she's a true testament that grief does not have to be something that holds you back in life. It can actually be something that gives you a very beautiful, very powerful gift to move forward in life and not just heal yourself, but go out there in the world and help other people learn how to navigate their own grief journeys. Allie, thank you so much for being a guest on today's show. It was amazing to get to talk to you. And I just wanted to say from the bottom of my heart, thank you for being so open and so vulnerable with your story. You're going to help more people than you know on your journey. And I just know that about you.
well, thank you, Chris. I really appreciate that. And thanks for having me on. It's been
And
a challenging but great conversation.
I'm really happy to hear it. It's been an awesome day talking to you, and I really look forward to keeping in touch with you.
Absolutely.
Well, I want to thank listeners for joining Allie and I on today's episode of the Empower Grief Journey podcast. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with somebody you know who could benefit from Allie's story. For more episodes that are designed to empower you and support you during your grief journey, visit empowergriefjourney.com and subscribe to this podcast. You can find us on Apple and Podbean. The Empower Grief Journey is all about honoring your journey, embracing your emotions, and finding strength in your own time. I want you to know you're never alone on this journey, and together we can navigate grief with courage and compassion. Until next time, be kind to yourself and take your grief journey one step at a time.